So I get to say this every single month. This month is no exception. We beat our previous record, which was set last month for number of questions that were submitted to a Q&A, and that makes me happy. I love this feature so much. It really allows me to not just engage with all of you, which is fantastic, especially since we're doing so much of this over the interwebs, but to get an insight into what you're thinking about and what's important to you and what you might be challenged by or working through or struggling with. All of this gives me ways to tailor the way that I teach and the way that I share content, and to come up with class ideas, and sometimes just to reach out to people and start a conversation. So thank you so much. It means a lot. We have a lot. And I'm going to put all of them in the video this month because why not? So what I'm going to do is shorten. So we're going to move through them kind of quickly. If you want to know more about any of these questions, hit me up. I'll talk your ear off about it. So I have them printed out. I'm going to cover them to the best of my ability, and hopefully they answer your questions. Even the ones that I don't really have anything to say on, I'm still going to bring them up because I want to share that process with you. So let's get started, John. First is from Hannah. Thank you, Hannah. Have you worked with poisonous plants such as foxglove or hemlock? And if you have, in what way? So interestingly, I have very little experience with poison plant work outside of doing some flower essence work just a couple of times, with somebody else, going on a plant spirit journey led by somebody else. We grow a pretty beautiful stand of Datura here at the house, and that's about the extent of my personal relationship to poison plants. Is taking really good, we're fiercely protective of that stand of Datura. When they bloom, they get a lot of attention from people. A lot of passersby will stop and kind of try to figure out what's going on, and it is a big stand. So we're very protective of her, and I do spend a lot of time pruning and sitting with her. We've done some ritual work together, and I've actually dreamed some ritual about Datura, which was really interesting because, again, haven't really put a lot into working with that plant. So I was surprised to get that kind of gift. But I very much respect poison plant work. A friend of mine, Kobe Michael, the Poisoner's Apothecary, fantastic work. Catherine Soley, I respect her work so much, and she's somebody that I really respect the way that she does the work. So thanks for the question. If there's an update to that in the year or two ahead, I'll let you know. It's a cool question. Thanks. Sarah, a medical herbalist I know of 30 years experience, says that for most of the clients he works with nowadays, stress is the root of their issues. Is this the same for you? And if so, are there recurrent themes in the type of stress? Couldn't agree more. And in fact, when we look at research from allopathic medicine, from standard Western medicine, and I know this because one of my areas of expertise and fascination is in the class of herbs called adaptogens, and part of what brought me into this work was stress, anxiety, CPTSD, OCD, that kind of spectrum of disharmony. So when we look even through the lens of allopathic medicine, we see time and time again that stress is either the cause of the most fatal diseases in this country, anyway, in the States, or the reason why otherwise acute or short-term treatable diseases turn into chronic terminal diseases. So there are a lot of pathologists and a lot of doctors and researchers who will confidently say that stress is the leading cause of death in our country. And, is stress causing the death directly? Generally not, but there's a comorbidity with, with something like congestive heart failure or heart disease or cancers, of course, where when stress is part of the mix, a treatable disease turns into a very difficult to treat disease, right? So totally agree with your friend. And I would say that more often than not, some aspect of the treatment protocols that I offer to people that I work with in a clinical setting have an acknowledgement towards stress, even when the person is confident that stress does not play a role in their physical or emotional or mental or energetic pathology, right? So I'm trying to think of an example where I wrote a protocol for somebody or built a formula and there was not a single ally in there to help with adaptive reserve, resilience, lowering cortisol levels, giving the person resources to move more efficiently out of fight or flight, out of the sympathetic states. I can't think of it. I mean, I really think that even just the stress of being sick is enough to make me want to provide stress support for people who are dealing with illness, you know? So totally agree. And I think that one of the best things that we can do for ourselves, one of the pillars of, you know, the model of contemporary Western herbalism is addressing stress, addressing sleep, rest, and recovery, addressing food and water intake, and addressing mindful movement that's suitable for our body type. So stress is at the top of the list for me. Totally agree. And as far as a pattern of the stress, no, I don't see a consistent pattern. I think that for some people, it's stress that comes from within, the way they think about the world, their mental atmosphere, trauma responses. For other people, it's environmental stuff that's happening, you know, air quality, water quality, access to food. So the quality of food that they're able to ingest can be incredibly stressful. Pharmaceuticals can be very hard on the body. Relationship stuff, you know, like it doesn't matter where the stress comes from in the way the stress can affect our health. And this is one of the beauties of adaptogenic herbs. And if you're part of our Patreon community, by the way, we did a whole course on adaptogens, so you can go watch that anytime. The flip side or the response to that is that we have this category of herbs, we have this collection of 12 or 15 herbal allies that will respond to stress regardless of where the stress came from, regardless of whether the stressful state was generated by what we're ruminating in our own minds or what's happening with our own blood pressure or from some external source, right? They don't care where the stress came from. They'll support us in learning how to navigate it. So very good question and very important thing to consider. Heather asked, related to this month's plant spirit journey, which would be echinacea, dandelion was so visual for me and echinacea not so much. This really surprised me and has me wondering if some plants show up more visually in your mind's eye than others. And I actually shared this experience. You know, echinacea for me was very visceral. It was a lot about body sensations and body feelings and the tongue buzz, right? And that was really pronounced for me. It was a lot of just sitting with how my body felt during the journeys rather than having these big, you know, visionary, imaginal ahas like we've had with other plants. So I think sometimes there's interesting patterns where a lot of us doing a journey will all experience like, oh, this plant was very blank or this plant was not very blank. But I also think there's an invitation to just honor your relationship with that plant. That there are plants out there that for some people are really, really visual. And for me, they're not at all, right? And I think that it's important to just lean into that so that we never lose sight of the fact that the work that we're doing is sorceress. It's based on relationships between two individual persons, you and the plant spirit, and that flow of reciprocity will manifest however it does based on the unique attributes of each of those two persons coming into intentional connection. So if a plant is not super visual for you and you're used to most plants being visual, it just speaks to your connection to that plant. Maybe they're going to challenge you to step into a sensory space that's not very visual because visual is really comfortable for you. Maybe they just don't have a lot to say to you. Maybe the relationship's not a really strong one, right? Sometimes the benefit of the work that we do with the sits is learning which plants we don't have a super strong connection to. You know, that's just as valuable as knowing the ones that we do, right? Where to put our energy. Where's the good energy ecology in this work? So it could be the plant, it could be your relationship. Either one of them is right. You know, it doesn't mean anything. You're not doing it wrong. You're not trying hard enough. Some of them just roll in a different way, which I think is cool. The next one is from, I think, pronounced Cage. I apologize if that's wrong. So I'm very new to the idea of animism, and with that, I've been struggling a lot lately with the guilt of consuming other living things to survive. I get we all have the right to exist, but the guilt still remains. How do you deal or go about this issue? Really lovely question. Thank you. You know, this gets into some philosophy that's personal, and I think not everybody will agree. So I'll just share what I think, but ultimately, you know, with these kind of things where the path of animism is an ethical path, not a moral path, right? Meaning that there is no 10 commandments that you have to follow in order to be a good person. Rather, there are ethical choices that in the moment and based on the circumstance are the right choices to make, whereas in a different circumstance, they might be the wrong choices to make. So ethics are a very heart-centered way to respond to circumstances in our lives. Morals are like, here's what you have to do to be counted among the good people, and if you don't do those things, you're a bad people, right? I don't like that. So we say this is a relatively amoral path, but ideally a highly ethical one. So plants consistently show up in a way that invites eating, right? I have never experienced anyone or any plant spirit work where the plants have said, you know, spinach is like, please stop eating us. We hate when you eat us, and we don't like it. Actually, you know, so much of the signature of plants kicks on our desire faculties, right? When we see a ripe strawberry, it's enough to make your mouth water, right? The plant is in some ways trying to like get our attention, and those plants also carry the building blocks that we as human persons need to survive. So I think that the plants like to be eaten. I think we're supposed to eat the plants. I think the way that we grow them, the way we steward them, the way we express gratitude to them has a lot of room for improvement, but being harvested and eaten, they seem to really enjoy when we do that, when we grow them for food and medicine and fiber and fuel and shelter and beauty and all of that. They're, of course, conscious, sentient beings, but that does not mean that they experience pain in the same way that we do, or that they experience attachment to self in the same way that we do. Remember that, you know, basil, all basil plants are an expression of the singular basil spirit. So when you take a cutting from a basil plant, every other basil plant that exists is an embodiment of that same person. You're not, even when a whole plant is harvested, when I harvest a whole ashwagandha plant at the end of the year, root and all, that plant is being killed. But there's an awareness that the spirit is not being killed. The spirit resides in every expression of plant that exists as one body. So it's like, you know, plucking a hair from the head of the ashwagandha spirit. Again, how it's done, what ritual, what gratitude, what heart space is meaningful. Most of us don't have the ability to control that very much because we're getting our food from the stores, but we can still be so grateful. In fact, somebody brought up, Christine, I think, brought up in the comments for this conversation about the importance of saying grace, of saying gratitude before food. To me, that is probably the most important act of reciprocity we can give to our food plants, right? To just say thank you. I personally don't consume any animal-derived products at all, haven't for a very, very long time. And there's not a lot of ethics wrapped up in it from like the judgy standpoint. Like when people hear that about me, they're like, oh, he's going to be this really judgy vegan. I don't even talk about it that much. It's pretty personal for me. But I will say that where I live and what I have access to, in order for me to consume animal products, I would have to support a system that is the most detrimental system to the planet as far as ecology and the health and wellness of the planet goes, and is also, I think, a model of deep human supremacy models, and doesn't take into consideration the sovereign rights of animals. So while I have no judgment about somebody that goes out and maybe hunts an animal in the wild or whatever, factory industrial farming I feel is very problematic, and from an animist standpoint, and to raise an animal in captivity with limitations, with the drugs and the pharmaceuticals and the exposure to disease, the constantly elevated stress levels, even the most free range farms are still not free, right? It's still a farm. I have a problem with that. So I don't participate in it. And to me, that's an example of ethics, that if I was in a different situation, my response to it might be different, but given where I live, when I live, and how animals are treated in agriculture here, it just doesn't feel right to me, so I don't do it. So I eat only plants, and I eat a lot of them, and I like to say thanks to them when I eat them, right? Okay, next up, I wanted to ask what journeying looks like for you from a scheduling perspective throughout the year. When you do a 29-day sit, is that the only plant you sit with throughout the month, or do you sit with other plants also? I wouldn't think you'd want to sit with multiple new plants at once, but I'm thinking specifically of plant spirit familiars. Do you sit with them to maintain a relationship outside of journeying with new plants? Freaking-tastic question. And you hit the nail on the head. I would not want to sit with new plants more than one at a time, for sure. Like when I'm doing a new sit with a new plant, or we're doing something with the community where we're all gathering around one plant together and sitting, I minimize, especially for the first week or so, as much possible contact with other ritualized plant sitting as I possibly can, because I want to give that person an opportunity to be heard, right? So it's like if you're going to meet a new person and maybe you have agreed that you're going to go to some local coffee shop. You don't want to go sit down at the table with them and order coffee and like be on your phone the whole time, flipping through a book, talking to somebody else. You want to like be fully engaged and listen to everything they have to say, even look like their body language, how they showed up, what questions they're asking, all of that stuff. So at least for that first week or so, I'm generally pretty diligent about quieting my plant spirit work other than that one plant. And then I might bring someone else back in for other work that I'm doing, but the relationship is always very established. So a couple perspectives here. First, choose a time of day to do your plant spirit sits and stick with it. And then you can separate other work you're doing with familiars by 12 hours. So let's say that you're somebody who can sit with the new plant spirit in the morning, right? You can do our rituals, guided meditations that we do, whatever, in the morning. Then in the evening, you have this time to sit with a familiar plant, or one that you've been cultivating a relationship for the last year or so, or one that maybe, because this has happened, maybe we sat with 2 months ago and you haven't been able to stop sitting with them, right? The sit wasn't wrapped up in 29 days, and so you're continuing with that. I know there are at least a few people that are still doing dandelion work. Maybe not every day, but they've reached out and said, I'm not stopping. I'm not going to quit. I say, cool. Separate it by 12 hours, separate it by your day, or dedicate a day or two a week to that plant. So you can get creative, and you can absolutely do multiple. People that are in like my situation where I'm in clinical practice, I'm seeing clients, and I do energetic work with clients as well. I'm tapping into particular plants very deeply many times throughout the day, a big variety of plants that I have a connection to. And sometimes that switching around happens several times in the course of an hour, right? So it's totally possible. I just think, like you said, no new ones. Like, get to know the voice of a plant well enough that you could, like, this is not literal, but let's say in a 15-minute meditation, every 5 minutes you could take a different plant. So you could start with one, wait 5 minutes, do another one, wait 5 minutes, do another one, and end with one. And you would be able to drop into the voice of those 3 or 4 plants relatively quickly, even though you're only giving yourself 5 minutes to fully experience, right? That the contrast is there. So super good question. I've actually put a tick next to this one to do its own class on, because I think this is a cool question, and I bet lots of people have asked this. So thank you. Donald, I was curious about seasonal deity work. Do you include the season's associated element as the main focus in the work? Also, are there specific energetics involved? So this is a good question. This is another one that will take us on a little bit of an unavoidable tangent, I think, because not everybody does deity work in relationship to following a plant spirit path. The people who do don't always work with the same deities, right? And sometimes the way that triune of power that I talk about between self, plant, and deity changes the work completely, because now we're sort of acclimating our work to the plant we're working with and the deity that we work with, and we're doing all of it together rather than 2 insular practices, right? I want to reaffirm in this moment that the plant path is non-dogmatic, it's organic and intuitive, and it is not tethered to any specific spiritual tradition. So depending on how good of a job I'm doing, you should be able to take any part of this and plug it in relatively effortlessly to an existing spiritual path or cultic practice or even dogmatic tradition, and find that it adds to it, as long as that tradition is animistic in nature. If it's not, the animist or non-animist, the animist or transcendentalist perspective, one of them is going to have to win. It's really hard, I think maybe impossible to hold one in each hand, right? So whether you're doing some cool pagan stuff, some witchy stuff, some druid stuff, some intuitive, do whatever you want stuff, some cultic practices, following a path of Hecate or Santa Muerte. I'm just thinking of stuff I've heard people say they do in our group. There's even some folk Catholic people. I mean, there's no reason that this shouldn't work. So I just want to mention that, because if this is the first time people have heard us talk about deity work, I want you to know you're good. So do you include the season's associated element as the main focus in the work? So what I think you're asking is, I work a particular compass that allows me to have a language and an access point into the patterns of nature, right? So in the spring, we work with the element of air. Air is rising and lifting. It transfers pollen. It carries the breath. It shakes us off the darkness of winter. Do I work with that particular element in relationship to deity work? Sort of. I would say that my deity work, the cultic practices that I do around the deities that I work with, are more about their agricultural connection to the wheel of the year. And I'm lucky in that the deities that I work with are all pretty harmonized in how that works for them. But following, because I work only with very plant-related deities, shocker, I know, right? Following what's in their mythos during the spring, what's in their mythos, stories about them, folklore during the summer, during the winter, adjusting my work around that. But then on a more sorcerous, like magic or ritual level, that's where I really tend to consider the element. So thinking a lot right now about the kind of medicine I'm making, the kinds of classes I'm doing, what I'm doing personally around the element of air, right? So hopefully that answers your question. If not, send me a message, we'll clarify. Chan asks, I've heard you talk a bit about song, story, chant, and petition in this kind of work, but I'm wondering if movement has any role in the process. I always feel like so much of following the medicine is already body work and definitely helpful in healing and releasing, but movement has always been a big part of emotional processing, freeing the body and spirituality in so many places, and for me. I've often approached plant spirit work too intellectually and would love to find ways to get more in my body with the work. Maybe find ways to incorporate touch, dance, and movement. Any thoughts on this? You know, I feel called out on this one because other than time spent in the garden and hiking and on herb walks, I really don't have a very physically embodied practice, and I think that it's awesome, right? I remember Chan, who was asking this question, also taught a few years ago in herb school a little practice where each person sort of invoked the spirit of a particular plant. I think maybe we all did the same plant. Maybe we did different ones. I don't remember. And then we moved through the room as sort of letting that plant ride us, right? Like influence our movements, influence the way we moved, the way we carried ourselves, maybe the sounds that we made, almost giving a locomotive body space to plants who are normally relatively, set in soil. And I found that to be very profound. I have noticed that when I'm outside in nature connecting with plants, that my posture and my physical demeanor will sometimes shift the deeper into a resonant state with a plant that I get. But I love this. I like the idea of, during a plant spirit sit, when you're taking the dose or whatever, making space for, if I were to embody physically what this plant looks like or feels like in the moment, what would that be? And to just stand up and let yourself move into that posture or stand in it or whatever. I think that has the potential to drop this into a tissue state level that sometimes gets missed, right? In the way that I teach this. So there's a lot of room to play and explore there. Thank you for bringing that up. Let's figure out how to put that together and do a class on it. Christine asked, I'm really looking forward to my first plant spirit journey and have read up your guidance as a way of becoming attuned to the experience. I just wonder, for example, echinacea. Mine right now are just tiny, weeny shoots, so would not have been visible in the soil when the journey with them took place. Can you explain how the experience works in the dark months when everything is dormant? So we talk about this a lot, plant spirit work in the winter. There's actually an advanced class on Patreon that you can go watch of ways and ideas to work with plants when they're sleeping, right? And for me, it's actually a quite magical experience because it sort of forces us to connect with the spirit of the plant without having a physical presence to hold on to. We really have to step into that imaginal realm to get there. And that's a muscle in this work that we really want to flex. We really want to be strong there. So there's that part of it. The flip side of it is in stewarding the medicine, right? That your echinacea plants are just babies right now, but soon it'll be June, July, August, and they'll be gorgeous. And maybe, our little stand of echinacea, I think they're on their 4th or 5th year. So we're going to start harvesting roots this year. And we'll bring that medicine in and, brush it off and cut it up so that it doesn't mold and put them in the food dehydrator or hang them or set them on parchment paper. And we'll dry them, and then they'll go into beautiful glass jars and into the apothecary, and they'll hang out there as vessels of spirit until we call on them for medicine or whatever. And there's also so much magic there of connecting to a plant in the dead of winter that you grew, harvested, dried, and stored the previous growing season. And now you're kind of taking the whole thing to the end of the full circle, right? From seed to medicine. there's something really beautiful about wrapping that up. And oftentimes that happens in the winter. Sometimes we're fortunate enough to go out and harvest fresh plant material, for our medicine, but a lot of times we're working with plants that we've already harvested and dried, and they're in jars or bags now. And so we go to them first, and wrapping that up after we've stewarded the plant is just really, really beautiful. So it can be challenging to not be able to go out and look at those beautiful cone flowers, to feel the texture of echinacea leaves, to smell the smell of fresh root, to look at the soil around the plant, to see the animals, the insects that come and frequent echinacea. But it does require us to step more into that visionary space. And sometimes the way that I choose the plant we're sitting with during those months is to choose one that is really easy to identify and really easy to sit with, like echinacea, at a time when we can't do that, right? There's also been times that we've sat with tree medicine during the winter, where for folks to go out and confidently connect to that plant, they have to learn a bark pattern, because there are no leaves, no flowers, nothing they can use to fully identify that tree unless they've come to know the tree well enough to say, that's the bark pattern of linden. I'm 100% confident, even though there's not a single leaf on this tree, right? So it helps us flex a different kind of muscle, which I think is important. And if you loved that and you want to sit with echinacea when echinacea wakes up, a couple questions back, you can double up and sit with them again when you can go out and be next to them in person, which is awesome. Last question we're going to do this month. Sharon asked, do you know anything about Indian sarsaparilla as far as safety and everyday use as a drinking tea? 2 teaspoons per 16 ounces. I see things which state it as a substitute for New World sarsaparilla, but that it is an entirely different plant. So wondering if there is anything I need to watch out for when drinking Indian sarsaparilla on a regular basis, which I've been doing for a while because I love the taste. Yes, the taste is incredible. Hemidesmus indicus. Definitely a different plant. And here's an example of something I'm not going to talk about because I don't know. I'm going to do some research on this and reach out to you, Sharon, directly, because most of the way that sarsaparilla shows up in market, so when people do like herbal root beer blends for doing like fermented ginger bugs, and pretty much everything outside of like very specific, Southern folk medicine. I'm thinking of like Phyllis Light, stuff Phyllis Light would talk about, is I think the Indian sarsaparilla, right? So I would say it's probably worth treating them different and trying to get good monographs on each herb. And there may be some overlap because there's some overlap in signature with these plants, which is where the folk name share comes from, I think. That root beery smell, the color, the blood nourishing color. Maybe there's a leaf thing as well. I could be wrong on that. I feel like I remember something. So this could be an example of 2 plants with some signature, some expression, some botanical expression similarities that have led us to like lump them under one folk name of sarsaparilla, but they're 2 different plants in my opinion. And this is why I love scientific names, and I really, really, really encourage people, as boring and like non-magical as it feels, to learn the scientific names. It's the only way that when we're talking about 2 different plants that we can know that outside of folkloric or common names. You know what I mean? The scientific names, it's the only way that we can have a good discussion, with somebody across on the other side of the world and say, this is what I'm talking about when I talk about sarsaparilla. Oh, that's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about Hemidesmus indicus. And say, oh my God, 2 different plants. I'm so glad that I didn't assume your materia medica on this plant was copy paste to what we call sarsaparilla. So many examples of that. And also there is magic in the scientific name, especially the Latin ones, right? They sound very ceremonial magic. And there are some plants, one example off the top of my head of many is mullein, Verbascum thapsus, who in my work with that plant actually prefers that scientific name Verbascum over the common name of mullein. It doesn't happen often, but there are plants that I've worked with. Juniper is another one. Juniperus loves that like more regal sounding juniperus rather than juniper. Mullein Verbascum thapsus has shown for me in my work with that plant, and I work a lot with that plant, I get their attention faster with the scientific name than the common name. So there's a little classic Josh sidebar tangent on scientific plant names that have nothing to do with Sharon's question at all. So there you go. Guys, fantastic questions this month. Thank you so much. I appreciate the time and effort that you put into asking these and to following up with one another in the chat. That's probably my favorite part of this, is that when somebody posts a question, before I even get to the part of the month where I get to do the video, 5 people have already been like, oh, here's my experience, or have you thought about this, or here's this class I watched from this great person on YouTube. It's incredible. I learned so much. So thank you. Here's looking forward to questions in April as we wrap up March's questions. Happy spring, everybody. I'll see you soon.